All right, let's get into it. We're going to be talking about late 19th and early 20th century Russia, a gigantic empire that was just teetering on the edge. You have to imagine it like a giant pressure cooker, just simmering with all this tension from feudalism, from famine, and from this absolute unchecked power of the Tsar. In this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how that pressure cooker was set to explode. So here's our roadmap. First, we'll see just how far Russia had fallen behind the rest of Europe. Then, we'll look at this bizarre and destructive cycle created by the last few Tsars. After that, we meet the man himself, the totally unprepared Nicholas II. We'll touch on this radical new idea called communism that starts bubbling up, and finally, we'll get to the breaking point, the first revolution in 1905.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this story, you have to understand the world Russia was living in. Because while the rest of Europe was just hurling forward into the modern age, Russia felt like it was stuck in a time warp.
And this really lays out the difference perfectly. I mean, look at this. Over in the West, you've got these blossoming ideas of liberty, you've got factories, trains, industrialization, and the beginnings of citizen rights. But in Russia, it was a totally different world. You had an autocracy where one guy, the Tsar, had absolute power. It was a feudal society where most people were serfs, which meant they were basically owned by landlords. And famine was a constant, devastating threat. The Tsars had all the power, and they had zero intention of ever sharing it.
So that brings us to the rulers themselves, because the actions of the last three Tsars in particular created this really chaotic, vicious cycle of like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, a little bit of reform, then a whole lot of repression, and it left the entire country dangerously unstable. So let's meet them.
So here they are, the last of the line. You have Alexander II, who actually tried to be a reformer. Then his son, Alexander III, who saw what happened to his dad and went in the complete opposite direction as a hardcore repressor. And finally, his son, Nicholas II, who, as we'll see, was just tragically unprepared for the storm that was coming.
Okay, so let's start with Alexander II. He does something huge. He frees the serfs in 1861. Now that sounds great on paper, but there was a massive catch. To get their freedom, the serfs had to pay these crippling redemption payments back to their old landlords for 49 years, so for most of them, almost nothing actually changed. Instead of gratitude, this created a whole lot of resentment, and in the end, it didn't save him. He was assassinated by revolutionaries with a bomb in 1881.
So his son, Alexander III, watches his father get blown up, and he draws a very simple, very clear conclusion: reform gets you killed. So he does the exact opposite. He unleashes his secret police, the Okhrana, to just crush anybody who questions his power. He goes after ethnic and religious minorities, trying to force them to be more Russian. Basically, any talk of limiting his absolute power was completely shut down. He really earned his reputation as the great repressor.
So after that harsh, iron-fisted reign of Alexander III, the throne passes to his son, Nicholas II. And this is where things go from really bad to so much worse. Because Nicholas was, by his own admission, completely unready to rule this massive, complicated empire.
I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. These are his words. He knew he was in way over his head. His own father hadn't really trained him. He thought Nicholas was kind of weak and girly. And yet, here's the dangerous part. Nicholas truly believed that he was chosen by God to be Russia's absolute ruler. That combination of deep insecurity and absolute belief in his own divine right, it was going to be a disaster.
And his reign starts with just an absolute horror show. For his coronation party, the government promises free food and beer in Moscow. Of course, starving peasants just surge onto the field, and in the chaos, a massive stampede crushes nearly 1,500 people to death. But the real damage, the part that stuck, was what Nicholas did next. Instead of publicly mourning with his people, he went to a fancy party with a French ambassador that same night. Right from the get-go, that single decision earned him the nickname Nicholas the Bloody.
So, with the Tsar's rule looking more and more brutal and just hopelessly out of date, people started looking for other options. Some were looking at Western-style democracies, but a small, really dedicated group of intellectuals was getting hooked on a much more radical idea, communism.
And right at the center of this movement is this guy, Vladimir Lenin. He was brilliant, he was driven, and as this quote kind of perfectly shows, he was an absolutely massive, ill-tempered jerk who was completely convinced he was right about everything. You could disagree with him about revolutionary theory, or apparently even Care Bears, and he would just unload on you. There was no compromise in this guy.
Well, with a personality like that, it was pretty much inevitable that the Russian Communist Party was gonna split. Lenin wanted a small, tight-knit group of totally loyal, professional revolutionaries who would do exactly what he said. So he formed his own faction, the Bolsheviks, which ironically means the majority. The other, more moderate group that was open to more members became known as the Mensheviks, or the minority. And believe me, this split is going to become very important down the road. So let's recap, right?
You've got this deeply unpopular, kind of clueless czar. You have horrible conditions for pretty much everyone, both the peasants in the fields and this new industrial working class in the cities. And you've got this radical communist movement just simmering under the surface. All it needed was a spark to set the whole thing off. And that spark came in 1905 thanks to two back-to-back disasters.
So with all this unrest growing, Nicholas and his advisors decide on a classic move from the autocrat's playbook. Start a short, victorious war. The idea is you drum up a bunch of patriotism, you get everybody waving flags, and they forget how miserable they are. They looked to the Far East and thought they'd pick a fight with what they assumed was a weak, backwards little nation, Japan.
Well, it was a short war, all right? But it wasn't victorious. Not for Russia, anyway. The Japanese military had been modernizing like crazy, and they handed the Russian Empire a stunning, absolutely humiliating defeat. So instead of boosting patriotism, the loss just sparked massive outrage back home. The Tsar looked weaker and more incompetent than ever before.
And that humiliation led directly to the final straw. On a Sunday in January 1905, this priest, Father Gabon, led a totally peaceful march. It was workers and their families heading to the Tsar's winter palace. They weren't calling for revolution. They were literally carrying a petition to their little father, the Tsar, just asking for better working conditions. But Nicholas wasn't even in the city, and the troops who were there were ordered to stop the marchers. So they opened fire on the unarmed crowd.
It became known, forever, as Bloody Sunday. We think about 1,000 unarmed men, women, and children were shot down, and this one event just shattered everything. The centuries-old idea of the Tsar as this divine father figure, the protector of the Russian people, it was gone. That bond was broken by bullets.
And you can see the result right here. The entire country just exploded. You had massive strikes that paralyzed all the major cities. Peasants started rising up and seizing land from their landlords. And this is the one that really terrified the Tsar. Units in the military actually started to mutiny. The 1905 revolution had officially begun.
So how in the world did Nicholas survive this? Well, with his back against the wall, one of his advisors came up with a pretty clever plan. He realized the opposition wasn't one big group. It was liberals, workers, peasants, all with different goals. So to divide them, he made a promise to the liberals. He'd give them an elected assembly, something called the Duma. And it worked. The liberals were satisfied, and they peeled away from the more radical revolutionaries.
So with the opposition now split and the war with Japan over, the Tsar brought his most loyal troops back from the front. He used the army to just brutally crush the peasant uprisings and arrest all the leaders of the workers' councils. And that Duma he promised? Yeah. As soon as he felt like he was back in control, he passed new laws that stripped it of almost all its power, proving that his promises were completely empty.
So this is the key takeaway, right? Nicholas II survived 1905. Many historians call it the dress rehearsal for the main event in 1917. But he only survived through tricks and brute force, not by actually changing anything. He learned absolutely nothing from the whole experience and went right back to being an absolute monarch. Which really leaves us with one big question. What was going to happen when that pressure started building all over again and the real show began?